I'm Chris Sinco, a UX design lead on Android Studio and Jetpack Compose.
I'm Paris. I'm a product manager for the Android developer tools team.
Yeah, and we're here today to kind of talk through some of the UX work we've done around Jetpack Compose and the guidance materials. So the UX team, we actually end up working on like all things that have to do with Android development. So most people are familiar with Android Studio, so we work on the tools and the emulator. But we also work on the languages and the APIs, so the Jetpack libraries, Jetpack Compose, some of the platform things. And then on the guidance side, we work on everything that's on developer.android.com. So that goes from docs to code labs to samples and also on GitHub. But today, we'll probably just focus on the guidance work specifically. And so we'll walk through some of the UX work that we've done over the years to kind of make the guidance materials more usable and more delightful for you to learn Compose. And I assume most people have tried Compose or used Compose? Show of hands? OK, cool. Yeah, it seems every year that number just goes from all the way up. So I think for those who are familiar with Compose, you've probably run into the Jet apps that are on GitHub. So today I kind of wanted to tell a little background story about how the Jet apps came to be and why we built them. So the Jet apps, they're a set of curated samples that are on GitHub. There's a lot now, but it really only started with maybe 4 or 5 in the beginning. But it's meant to be kind of these beautiful samples that showcase how to actually use Compose to build a beautiful app, but also focus on specific concepts in the API. But if we rewind back to 2019 and like why we did it, and this is a fun old internal logo for Compose. It's a little like plain. When we first started, we were thinking, OK, with Compose, there's an entire UI toolkit to rebuild. We don't have a lot of time to rebuild the entire thing to make our deadline. And so how do we kind of focus on the UI components that really matter for developers to kind of get started to build apps with Compose? And so we took a look at, this is a screenshot of the material components. But what we also did was we actually looked at kind of specific apps in the ecosystem to kind of categorize them and figure out, what are canonical app types. And so in this case, we took Medium because, a lot of apps are news feeds that just have lists and like load things from the internet. And so here we kind of show a breakdown of like, well, if we broke down Medium into all the different app components, what do you think we would need to build, and then what was the depth of the features for each component? Like, does every component have to have every behavior that we've ever implemented, or is there a minimum set? And this was all used to kind of prioritize how we could actually get to the first developer preview as fast as possible. But in this exercise, so because we were building a new UI toolkit, it was like, well, we should actually try to exercise it as if a designer or like a full-on development team actually were building apps. And so in this process, we would design and implement the APIs on the toolkit side, but then we'd actually have our design team design the apps for real. And then we'd also work through the pain of like, well, is this API flexible enough? Is the designer trying to do something really crazy that we can't do? And that's all really good feedback because that just makes the toolkit more robust so that you can build better and more high quality, beautiful Android apps. And we would just rinse, wash, repeat this over time, and we actually still do this today. So in the beginning, we had Jet News. We just had one sample. It was really inspired by that previous breakdown of Medium. It was meant to be representative of a type of canonical app, just to inspire developers to try Compose. In the early days, it was actually very successful. One of the biggest reasons is that it was the only, I guess you would say, piece of documentation that was kept up to date with every release, which was happening every 2 weeks. And so kind of learning from that as we marched on to the alpha release, we were thinking, OK, so why was this successful? And so one of them was it was up to date. But the other thing was we thought it was representative because it felt like an app that someone would actually design and ship. But the other part of it was focused. So it wasn't a full-blown app. So if you were actually looking at the source code, it was much easier to kind of parse and reuse code and copy paste versus trying to deconstruct someone's heavily architected production app. And so we really focused on those two things as we thought about going to alpha. And that's where we kind of ended up building more of the Jet apps. We also took some inspiration from the material design team. So years ago, Material did this thing called Material Studies. And here they kind of had these 8 categories, and they thought, okay, so for each of these apps, can we build specific studies that focus on specific concepts to help people learn things? And so we took that framing to kind of frame how we would build the Jet apps from a developer point of view. So at Alpha, we ended up shipping a bunch of these Jet apps. And so I think we had Jet News in the beginning, but we had Jet Survey, we had Jet Snack, Jet Caster, built Jet Chat. We're Google, we like building chat apps. And then we also, we actually ended up implementing some of the material studies in Compose because they were only in views at the time. And and how we approached it, so like I said, we actually did approach it like a UX team, so we built a design system. So we had branding, we had typography, we had icons, we had custom fonts, to kind of like do it for real and see how well Compose actually scaled to meet the demands of our design system. And so I think with each app, like I said, we tried to focus on specific APIs or things about Compose that we wanted to push. And so Jetcaster's kind of one of the most interesting parts is it really plays on like how easy it is to do theming. So it's easy enough to set colors in a material theme, but what if you could actually extract colors in real time and then change the layout at the same time as you're swiping? So here you were kind of like swiping through this feed at the very top. And what you would do is, like, as you were swiping, you would extract the dominant colors using the palette API, and then kind of change the gradient in the background. But at the same time, we were also trying to maintain the right level of accessibility with the text. And so this is all happening under the hood. And this is something I think a designer would probably try to do. And so we're thinking, like, if you can pull this off in Compose with relatively less code, then that's a big win for us. And then the same with, so Jet Snack was interesting too, because as much as Google loves material design, we know not everyone uses material design. A lot of design teams have their own custom design system. And so one of the goals we also had with Jet Snack was, could we build a sample that really deviates from the material design system, and like, would the Compose APIs completely fall apart if someone were to do that? And so the goal of this was to do that, and so we basically introduced a ton more color keys. We introduced way more gradients to really stretch the system to see how well it would scale, and it actually did. And so this sample in particular is pretty popular now because anytime anyone asks, like, how do I do something that's not material in Compose, we usually point to Jet Snack. So in 2020, which is when we had shipped all these sample apps, these were kind of the different themes across all of them. So you can kind of see each one focused on different things. Jet Survey, I think, is kind of the lowest complexity. That one was really just about forms and input validation and really baseline material. And on the far end, you had Jetcaster, which had a lot of complexity, and it was actually becoming kind of a bigger app. And so in 2021, Google, we decided that we care about tablets and large screen. And so we are obviously investing in that heavily now. And so with Compose, we wanted Compose to actually follow suit as well. And so people were asking, well, if I'm building Compose, how do I use Compose to adapt to large screens and tablets and foldables? So, again, we could have built different samples, but we actually said, like, what if we actually take the existing samples and show how we would evolve that, because that's pretty much the similar journey that others would take, is to take the same app and adapt it. So here you see Jet News in the early days on a tablet, and it's not great. I mean, everything's very stretched. And so there was obviously work to do to make this better. And so these are some of the explorations. Actually, Paris did these explorations years ago. And so here, kind of experimenting with different layouts, like if you had more space, would the navigation actually change from more of a nav rail to kind of this like drawer look? For the detail view, like if we had an article, would it span the whole thing, or could it kind of like be in the center and you have a little toolbar on the left with a feed on the right? Just interesting explorations for foldables. This one too, so we never implemented this, but this was an interesting transition, which is like, well, if I went from fold to unfold, could we actually do that screen transition? I hope we one day get to do this, but we haven't done it yet. And then Jetcaster, so we ended up implementing this work for the Android Dev Summit last year, but this works in what's called tabletop mode. So in the bottom right, It's kind of this folded look, and the idea is like you can have this player with the play bar on the bottom and then the album art on the top, just to kind of show people how you could adapt to the different postures for foldables, all in Compose. And then the other thing that emerged in 2021 was Material U. So Material, had a new iteration of their design system, and really it was focused on the user and all about dynamic color. And so, again, with the Compose samples, we were like, well, we could build other samples or just extend the ones we have. And so with JetChat, this was kind of the first sample we did back then. And so what we did is we tapped into the dynamic color theming. So here, this is more of the baseline theme for it. But then we also updated with new material components as well. And then we also showed like, well, what if you could change color schemes on the fly? And so there's not a demo here, but if you change your wallpaper, then JetChat will actually change colors at the same time. And then later this year, so kind of continuing the Material U work, we only did JetChat last year, but this year we've actually updated all the other apps. So we've done Jet News, Jet Survey, and Jet Snack. The work hasn't been published yet to GitHub, but it'll soon be up there. And so in 2022, the Jet family hasn't grown, but the complexity of the apps have grown. So kind of highlighting, we've updated a bunch of them to Material 3 or Material U. We've also adapted, Jet News, you could kind of see it's built now to kind of showcase how to build for large screen and tablet. Jetcaster kind of shows this adaptation to foldables. But something was still missing as we were going along with samples. And another thing that kind of came up along the way was the speed challenge. So maybe some of you participated in this early on, but this actually was kind of, again, from the UX team. And so the idea with this was we wanted to make learning Compose fast and fun, and this was, I think, around the first beta release. And again, we wanted to, put stuff out there that was representative of what a designer would create. The funny thing actually is the design spec that we ended up publishing on GitHub was intentionally made to make bad decisions to see how developers would adapt to it, because that's what reality happens. So, and the side effect though was, because this challenge was really focused on like a couple screens, it ended up being a really nice way for us to adapt it to code labs. And so I think MySoothe is probably used pretty frequently throughout the Compose code labs. And so that was just a nice side effect of the work. And interestingly, I think to the first point about making learning Compose fast and fun, we used the speed challenges pretty often internally to help people ramp up to Compose. Because the idea when we designed the challenge was like, well, you should be able to take the design spec and build these 3 screens in roughly 3 to 4 hours. Can be longer. But in doing that, people can learn Compose pretty quickly. And so we use it all the time. And I think, if there are people in your teams or companies that are learning Compose, this is often a really great way to just dive in pretty quickly. But across the samples, so, in terms of like how we broke down how people would learn from our samples, I think in the very beginning we had the Hello World, which is the tutorial. I didn't talk about the tutorial today, but I think a lot of you have gone through that. It's that very interactive page on DAC that goes step by step of how to use Compose, at least in the beginning with no install. But then, breaking down like learning concepts, that's where we kind of saw the Jet apps play a really good role, as well as the dev challenge and some of the code labs. But as people were trying to actually move to Compose to use in production, we didn't have a very compelling sample to explain that, because Android development is more than just the UI. And so with that, we came to Now in Android, which Paris will cover.
Thanks, Chris. So today, speaking of real production sample app, I want to tell you a little bit about Now in Android. We work very closely with the Java and UX team in producing this app. And so because this is a UX talk today, I'm going to tell you a little bit about more of the design journey and thinking of how we got there. But before I do, I'm just going to give you some context if you not already know what Now in Android is. So this is actually based on top of a series of the same name called Now in Android. It has 66 episodes so far. It's basically kind of like a update about what is going on in the Android development world today. And so what it does is, for each episode, it has a blog version, a video version, as well as a podcast version of the same content. And so here's just a example of one episode, what it contains. So you can see platform releases, articles, video samples, collabs of things that has happened. And so each episode of these kind of like different topics that you can like explore more. And the Now and Android app really is based on top of that series. So we use that as our data source, and we wanted to take it and see how we can build a sample app that actually provides developer some end user value. And so in order to do that, we basically focus on two key things. First thing, I forgot my next slide, but yes, so the goal was to publish a simple app which demonstrate how to solve real-world developer problems, and really to do that so that we can share our learnings about how we went through that process. And so to do that, there was two key things that we wanted to do. First is, as a sample app, it needs to, when it's open source on GitHub, it needs to be able to show you the best practices with opinionated design. So that means Jetpack Compose, that means material-free Kotlin, architecture components, and it also means that we want to go for using Android Studio to make sure that the build has best practices, and then we use different really consistency across how we set up compose previews, etc. A second goal here is, as a running app, we want to make sure that it actually provides a really nice user experience to actually help Android developers as an end user to keep up to date with the world of Android development. So with these kind of two different focuses, I think the key differentiator of this app is really about that end user value, which is something that we're continuing, starting from the Jet apps all the way to now Android, to really focus on. And this is kind of where the UX and design come in. So as part of this talk, I would just like to share with you two different design stories and journeys that we went through as we built the Now and Android app. The first one is the homepage UX. So the design team got basically a page of developer requirements from the DevRel team. So here's the full list of things that we really want to showcase to developers on GitHub. Like, here are the things that we want to teach. So full stack architecture, Jetpack Compose, and then we kind of did an analysis about what that block series, what the data model will look like. And this is the first version that came out of that exploration. Sorry, I think it didn't start where I thought it would be. But basically, the idea is that you would get a notification of Now and Android has a new episode that dropped. Then within this app, you can see the homepage is all about this episode 49. So you can watch the video that comes with it. You can switch between different episodes according to the dates that they came from. And then you can just browse through different topics of that app. And so I think this is a really nice representation of the blog, of what it does today. But then we ran a UXR study about what this design prototype. And what we found was that developers say, this is very interesting, but I actually would be more interested in like curated personal content. So because maybe I'm working on front end, and I'm working on, Firebase Task Lab, I'm working on this other thing. So like for me, the idea of looking at one episode with different topics isn't necessarily really useful. And so that particular feedback, which is something that we've never done, I think, for a sample app, is to run a user study. Then we actually came back and the design team explored that, and this is now the new version of the homepage app. So what happens now is you can basically select the different topics that you're interested in, and then your For You page just gives you cards that are specific to what you select. Then we move the entire kind of episode session into a separate page for those of you who are more interested in kind of still this episodic format. And this might be a really small UX decision, but that's not something that, if I purely only want to showcase particular technologies as a sample app, we don't really have to go through this process of iteration, but we just wanted to act like a real production UX team. So the learning from that is really kind of an iteration of design of what is based on top of what a real user will want, and only that can we also build a sample app that is truly unique. The second story I want to tell here is the process of applying material view, material free, onto the building the brand for non-Android. So to kind of just brief context again, so if you don't remember, Material U, one of the biggest thing that came out of it was dynamic theming. So the idea is that kind of extract color out of the app identity, and so you can basically pick background that are personalized to you, and your app color theme will kind of adapt to your personalization. And so the idea is that this is the user's background, this is how they will extract the different color, and these color palettes and tonal palette will be applied to the app design system. Now, this is very interesting as for a design team because the Android brand is very, very unique and very color-centric. Like when you see that green, you immediately think about Android. So how can we, I think this is one of the journeys that the design team had to run through is how can we actually apply material free, which is a system that is really colors, I guess, taking color out of the equation, but still have that brand identity. So this is the material free theme. And then so the design team started asking, how can we apply the Android colors? So the first thing that we did is we tried the most obvious idea. We seed the Android brand's color, the green, the blue, the red, and then directly into the material theme builder. And this is the palette that they came out of. So you can see, if we apply that color palette onto some of the sample screens, you can see that it seems like there's too much going on. Like especially the blue text description, it also doesn't immediately shout to you as something of a news source app. So then the second idea that we had is, what if we just take the green and put it into that tool and limit the palette to that primary brand color. Once we did that, this is actually what shows up. And so we're not entirely sure about kind of the energy. You can see that I think it has a little bit of this yellow that are in the background color. And then so as part of the critique, it seems like it also wasn't what spoke Android as well. So the third things we tried was what we thought, what if we just use our eyes and then we just particularly pick colors that we think will work onto that palette and see what that will produce. So unfortunately, once we do that, part of the things is that it actually is not accessible enough. So there were contrast problems with specific design. So to just give you an idea, you can see that especially in the dark theme, the text is actually really hard to read. So we thought, okay, it's time to pivot. I feel like it was interesting to kind of think through how can we actually really apply the screen and still have slight variation of Android. But maybe the direction we should take here is really think about what are other things besides color can speak Android. And we know it's very fun, it's very impactful. And so part of the idea here is to actually focus on the emotion. So what the design team did was they wrote out what they think non-Android as an app should speak to the end user. So it should be flexible, dynamic, fluid, and fun, attentive, lively, abstract. And so they took a completely different direction. And then here is kind of some of the latest explorations. So instead of thinking about color, what part of the exploration here is think about shapes, think about colors that speak fun, colors that speak energy. So I'm just going to show you some of the expression that came out of that pivot, which is, I think, using the idea of like animation and motion that tell you that this is the update of now, and then also the shapes that are quite bold for material free. So this is the first kind of exploration of this system and for the homepage. And then this is what I talk about basically looking at each topic that we have and playing around with some of the different shapes. And then this is what it will look like when you apply kind of a different color system, but it will still be very similar in how the emotion that it captures, and hopefully you feel that too. So this is currently what the final designs look like after some of the iterations, and hopefully you've seen this already, but this is kind of the different light and dark theme. And then this is what it will happen if we do apply that green theme, and we still feel like all of them speaks partly kind of Android energy. And so this is kind of what the design team had to went through for the process of adapting material-free. I think the learning here really is that this is by no way the perfect way. It was just a journey that we went through as a team, and that's something that we like. I think any unique brand that tries to kind of adapt material-free for design teams, something that they might went through. But instead of just kind of as a sample teach you how to structure and make material-free, we thought it would be really good for the design team to go through this system and kind of share that learning with everyone here. So this is the non-Android kind of app. Today I only focused a lot the learning journeys on design, but we actually kind of consistently put out learning journeys on other topics as well, so you can find things like architecture and modularization and more to come. So thank you, and I'm going to hand it back to Chris for some summary.
Thanks, Ferris. Yeah, so going through now in Android, I feel like it's completed the story for all the samples we have. And so, whether you are just getting started out with Compose, I think the tutorial is a great way to start. If you want to learn the specific APIs about Compose, then you got your Jet apps. We have the Dev Challenge as well if you want to redo that, and then as well as the Code Labs. And then really thinking, how do I bring Compose into my production app? And I think that's where now in Android kind of fills that. So, I think to summarize the UX work through all of this, really it was trying to build samples that were opinionated, but also vetted through internal dogfooding. So, we tried to put best practices in there, but also build it for real and go through the process that all of you have probably gone through when building apps. And I think that makes the UI toolkit even better. And so kind of to the second point, trying to use these to really showcase the power and flexibility of the toolkit. So whether you are completely sold on material or you want to deviate completely away from it, I think Jetpack Compose can work for both cases. And then I think kind of what's important is, over time we've had this tendency to create many samples, and then a lot of them get stale or get abandoned or not maintained. And so we wanted to have a really consistent, focused narrative over time. So as Compose and Android evolves, we want our samples to evolve hand in hand. And so in our mind, it's like we should just have the same samples and do that, have them adapt at the same time. And so this is an older tweet, but I wanted to make the point that it wasn't just designers designing. We actually, every detail that you see in the samples are based on some decision around trying to be intentional about how to showcase Compose or something else in Android. And then the last point, I think, I talked about how developer guidance is, really more in DAC, but I think really developer guidance kind of extends beyond that. I think most people go to developer.android.com or think about GitHub as where the guidance is, but, we want to actually have guidance permeate across all the parts of Android, the Android developer journey. So that's in the tools, that's in the actual libraries. I think a testament of a great library is you don't have to look up the documentation. The API is just intuitive, and you can kind of be in that flow. And so that's where we think guidance, there's opportunities there. And then even in Studio, I think there is a disconnect between Android Studio and developer.android.com. And so how do we bridge that gap as well so that, again, you can stay in the flow while coding and learning at the same time. And that's going to be our continuing journey, in the foreseeable future. But yeah, thanks. That's all. And we're a UX team, so if we would love your feedback. So this is an old link from 2021, but it still works, I hope. But yeah, we'd love to hear any. We do a lot of user research, and everything you tell us is certainly has impacted the product. So, thanks.